Welcome. All right. And so I'm trying to find a balance between giving you a heads up on the given assignments. And remember, you're getting extra credit. So for that reason alone, you're not wasting your time. Um, but giving you a heads up on the assignments, but leaving enough for you to watch the videos that I've already put together because the videos go through the material. All right. And so, pardon me as I go through the names here, but let's see here. All right. If you don't mind typing your name, Rosalind, could you please share with me your last name? Thank you. Gotcha. All right. And so we are covering the Spaniards, right? And the Spaniards in historiography, the Spaniards have been depicted as having a unique path, a historical path that the other colonizers, the Dutch, the French, the English over the Americas, did not necessarily follow. And that it begins with the manner by which the Romans uh, took hold of Spain uh, much more effectively and conclusively than they did England, calling it Britannia. And so there's a lot of there's perhaps more Roman influence over Spain than there is over England. You can make the argument that England is a little bit more Germanic um, in its historical legacy, if you will. And so that's for good and for bad, according to historians. For one, right, is the tie to religion. As you probably know, the Roman Catholic the Roman Empire, first under Constantine and then under one of his sons Theodosius of Spain, made Christianity and the Catholic Church the official instituted religion of the Roman Empire. And then, in addition to that, I'm looking for one of these names I can't find. I'm gonna have to write it down here. Um, sorry, need to find a more effective way of doing this. At any rate, the uh, the Spaniards, when the Roman Empire fell in 425 or so AD, then the Germanic people known as the Visigoths took over Spain. And it's ironic that although they took over Rome, they emulated Rome and they made the Roman Catholic Church stationed at Toledo, Spain, like Holy Toledo, the established religion of the Visigothic Empire. They took the 12 tables of Roman Constitution and copied it and formed it into their own constitution. They and then they didn't last very long. And then in the 700s, Ibn al-Tariq and a Berber and Moorish army from North Africa took over almost all of Spain and named it Al-Andalus. And so that's very unique for Spain that they had a Moorish takeover for given variations because you had many regions in Spain, and some of them successfully fought off the Moors for quite some time, and it's quite a dramatic story. But at any rate, they engaged in holy war against the Muslim Moors time and time again in one region then the next, etc. Then there are different kings that went down in the annals of history for being crusaders against the Muslim Moors. And for instance, they found the body of they believed to be the Apostle James, and at Santiago de Compostela, and it became a pilgrimage site. and they incorporated Santiago or James as their patron saint of holy war, and they would say Santiago con nosotros, right? James with us, as they would go into fight. My point being is they said the same thing in the Caribbean and the same thing in Mexico and the same thing in New Mexico when they fought against Native Americans. So there's the notion that the Spaniards had a uniquely contentious history whereby um, they became religiously fanatical, and so that's part of what the Spaniards call the Black Legend, because what the English and the Dutch historians did is they tried to say, see, the worst type of colonization is implemented by the Spaniards. The Americas are better off under us than under them. And so, at any rate, the Spanish contend this is all a Black legend. It's all a nefarious lie against us. All right. And so I have a Mexican American class, and we do this right here. And you see that legacy on number 2 of this assignment. And I'm just giving you context to the Spaniards. And so notice, right, they had the Romans take them over. They had different Greek communities come and colonize the Mediterranean coast of Spain. They had the Celtic people come in first to the native Iberians, as the native Spaniards were called. So they have a very multi-ethnic, multicultural history, Spain, that is. The Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, as well as the Romans, came in and brought different types of colonization patterns, as well as inventions and so forth to Spain. So by the time Spain colonized the Americas in the early modern era, the 14, 15, 1600s, the age of exploration, as it's called, right? Spain had lost her innocence. She knew what it was like to be colonized, to fight holy wars against the Muslim North African emirate. And the argument is they carried that holy war mentality, and they brought those inventions, especially when you look at inventions for warfare, the crossbow, gunpowder, etc., steel. Those were all virtually imported into Spain. And so she brought all of that with her to the Americas when she took over Central, South, and the bottom of North America in the 15 and 1600s. As early as 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, Florida, the longest surviving city that was colonized by a European power. As early as 1599, she came in and colonized New Mexico. And then a while later, she became famous in 1769 for bringing about the beginnings of the Sacred Expedition up California, with the 21 missions and the pueblos and the haciendas and the different trade networks of civilized, so-called civilized cities and in rural areas of colonization of California. All right. So I'm not sure how much I want to share, because I want to make you watch the video. But I share in the video some of the following things. So look at the viceroyalties that Spain claimed. So notice North America and parts of later United States were a part of the viceroyalty of New Spain. And so also, let's see here. So yeah, so you have that. And in 1502, 1492, you had the beginning, the first of the 4 voyages of Christopher Columbus, and it really opened up a system that was quasi-capitalistic, in that if you were willing to risk your life as an adventurer to come across the Atlantic Ocean and try to colonize and for your mother country, and try to bring back some type of commodity that was worthy of profit. And so oftentimes it was tobacco, sugar, sadly, slaves, African slaves, etc. Then you'd get a cut, you get a commission on those profits, and you also were promised advancement up the aristocratic scale of all of Europe, not just Spain. So, for instance, if you were a commoner and you came and fought here in the New World and helped bring about a new colonized area, sugar, tobacco, something, captured Native Americans as slaves and brought them back, you would be granted Hidalgo status. And Hidalgo was a minor aristocrat. And remember, Aristoi means the best in Greek. So the aristocrats, the nobles, they lived a different lifestyle. They were entitled to certain privileges and certain opportunities that other people were not, did not have, could not enjoy. And so it was a way to rise up the socioeconomic scale. And so you have that as number one on your assignment, where I'm trying to defend. And remember, some of these that I write tongue in cheek, because I'm thinking, you know what, I don't personally agree with what I'm writing, but I'm writing it anyway because I think it's thought provoking. In a book that I had read, or with a professor, an opinionated professor that I had sat under, etc. So keep that in mind, because number one is a case in point. I'm actually defending Christopher Columbus, saying that he felt as if his back were to the wall, and this was the only way to extricate himself and his family out of poverty and precarious conditions was to play the game, so to speak. You had merchants who would sit at tables. Literally, the word bank comes from the Italian word bench, and they would sit at these long benches with their some of their money, and they would ask one person at a time, "Why do I want you? Why do I want to employ you?" And people like Columbus came to realize that the best answer to give was, because I'll do whatever you ask. You want me to go to Elmina or Luanda on the Ivory Coast of Africa and pick up 100 slaves? I'll do it. You want me to go to the Caribbean and take over an island and fight either the Arawak, the Taino, or the Caribs and take the land from them? So be it. I'll do it, and so forth. And then, of course, the most infamous, arguably, well, it's a run up between two, were the takeovers of Peru and Mexico, right? Because with Mexico, the amount of blood that was shed with Hernan Cortez and his army fighting the Mexica or the Aztec, and with Pizarro, it was with the idea of treachery, of tricking one of the Prince brothers in the empire of the Inca, and double crossing him and brutally killing him to gain and secure power over the Inca Empire in Peru. And so the Spanish, not to mention, you have what they call the demographic catastrophe. When Spaniards came in the 1490s, by 1520, they did a census throughout the Caribbean and in Central and South America. And they believed to have discovered that millions, literally millions of Native Americans had died just in a span of 2 to 3 decades. And they believe it was a combination of epidemics that were inadvertent, of course, smallpox, mumps, measles, but also exploitation and brutality and war, etc. So in the other video, I show how Christopher Columbus came in. He immediately formed a military alliance with the Arawak against the Caribs. Um, and then he felt betrayed when his men at Fort Navidad were massacred by their Arawak allies. And the Arawak contended that the Spanish men were raping the Arawak women, which caused the beginnings of all the drama at any rate. And so he begins fighting against the very tribe that he came to ingratiate. And then with the Taino, it was mainly Puerto Rico. They found mineral wealth in Puerto Rico, and the Taino had been promised initially by the leaders, the Spanish leaders, that they would leave Puerto Rico alone. And some of the men went away and absconded with boats and stirred up trouble with the Taino in Puerto Rico looking for mineral wealth. And so it didn't take long, and they're at war with the Taino. So within 5 to 6 years, the Spanish were at war with all three major tribes of the Caribbean. And then 1519 to 1521, when Cortez went into Mexico, there's a guy named Castillo, Bernal Diaz del Castillo. And in the English translation, it's known as the Conquest of Mexico or the Conquest of New Spain. And if you had time on the side to read it, it reads like a telenovela. It is just dramatic soap opera fashion of misunderstandings, intrigue, deceit, etc. That leads to the fighting in 1521 and the fall of the Aztec Empire. So at any rate, when you're looking at the assignments, just be sure to take a look at my video, all right? Because I go over every number. Let's see how many you have here. So defending Columbus, number 1. Number 2, the title says a lot. Spain enslaved by the prejudices of her time. So look to the video and see what I say in elaboration of that. 3, hierarchical Spain. That it was nothing like what we would want. And I'll speak a little bit on number 3, if you don't mind. Within 10 years, by 1502, the Spanish started a bureaucracy in the Americas, in the Caribbean in particular, and then it spread throughout the Americas. And that was, they had a viceroy at the top, they had a visitor general who would come unannounced on behalf of the king. You had your judges who were handpicked back in Spain, as was the visitor general and the viceroy, obviously. So not very democratic. You had the governors. Then beneath the governors, you had the corregidores. And the corregidores, as you see right here, they had veto power over the cabildos, the city councils, the local city councils. And the cabildos were the only democratic element, arguably, in the Americas. And so the corregidores, they could, like the verb corregir in Spanish, correct, they could veto their decisions. And yeah, and so, and then alcaldes mayores were what we get the term mayor. They sometimes were handpicked, and then eventually they were elected. But you could make the argument that when you look at the economic system as well, you had the consulado, they granted monopolies. You had to be well connected to the Spanish crown to be able to trade in slaves and sugar and tobacco and in the major money-making enterprises. They allowed people to take the crumbs off the table, so to speak, at the local markets and local areas, so people could dabble in whatever trade they wanted and trade whatever commodities they wanted, as long as it were localized. But as far as international, at the major recognized ports, going to the Caribbean, back to Europe, going to Africa, you had to have the right papers. And to have the right papers, you had to have the right um, last name, the right family connections. And then also what they have found is a gentleman in the 1970s contended that there tended to be a pigmentocracy, a gradation of rank linked to pigment of skin. Literally at one point in the early 1500s, Ferdinand had required that settlers and people to certain offices have cleanness of blood, limpieza de sangre, and which I think is kind of a joke, because when you look at Spain's history, there's Greek, there's Celtic, there's North African, there's Near Eastern, all kinds of different groups that have amalgamated into the Spanish fabric. But yeah, so at any rate, you had those who were born in Spain and seemed and were perceived as officially as pure Spaniards, were peninsulares from the Iberian Peninsula. And it was almost always peninsulares who were the top positions, governors, the viceroy, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had criollos, and criollos or creoles were those who had two Spanish parents who had moved to the Americas, but they simply were born in the Americas rather than Mother Spain. And they were a notch down. And oftentimes, statistically, they rose in rank in the army or in the church. And they had certain minor political positions that they could gain access to. And then the majority of citizens, de facto, because so many single Spanish men moved to the Americas as conquistadores, as conquerors, or as adelantados, as men moving forward and claiming new pagan lands, were without Spanish wives. They ended up, having relations with Native American women. So de facto, places and regions like Mexico and Guatemala, parts of the Caribbean, etc., that most became mestizo, half Native American and half Spanish. And there were hardly any political positions you could gain as a mestizo, but you had some economic latitude to do several things. And then, of course, beneath the mestizos, you had the Indios, the natives, those who stayed in congregated areas like the Aztec and the Maya, and but were technically conquered. They could live semi-autonomous amongst themselves, but they had something known as the repartimiento. And with the repartimiento, they could ask for a certain percentage of those natives, certain number of days during the year or weeks during the year, had to engage in public works for the Spanish crown, building bridges and churches, etc., fighting in the army if need be, etc. And then what didn't last very long, but gave the Spanish a really bad name, was the first two generations had the oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name, the encomienda. And the encomienda is you are allowed to virtually enslave the non-Christian Americans, Native Americans that you conquer. And they have to work on your plantation and have certain duties that owe to you. And the only thing you had to do in return was to ensure that they became Christian. And these were known as the Alexandrine bulls, the papal bulls of Pope Alexander VI, who himself happened to have been a Spaniard at this time. And he mandated and gave Spaniards the right to do this, to conquer and enslave Native Americans, as long as they saw to their conversion to Catholic Christianity. But a subsequent king of Spain, Charles, he did away with the encomienda system because of people like Bartolome de las Casas, Las Casas was a defender of Native Americans, even though he himself was a Spanish priest or friar. And he became known as a defender of the Indios. And he had death threats, was called a traitor by his own Spanish people. And he wrote a very infamous history of the Spanish conquest, and he doesn't mince words. I remember in my Spanish class, he mentioned that he called the Spaniards ladrones, thieves, tigres, tigers, lobos, wolves, and said that they came in looking for whom they could devour amongst the natives. And he called the Native Americans ovejas mansas, meek sheep. And so he totally sided with the Native Americans. And then that's when Castillo wrote his history, fighting with Cortez against the Aztec as a Spaniard and a Catholic. He wrote what he meant to have been a refutation of Las Casas writings, and said, no, the Aztec were anything but meek sheep. They were devious, they were bloodthirsty, they were scary. We were constantly threatened by them. And so it's very interesting to read Las Casas pro-Native American book, and then read Castillo's pro-Spanish book, and try to infer what may have happened and may not have happened between those two very divergent accounts. All right. So are there any questions from anybody? So between this and the video that I ask you please to consider watching, all right, you should feel fine on assignment number 2. All right, but with number 3, with the Southern colonies, again, I'm going to limitedly say a few things, but I want you to please watch the video, because by the time we meet again on Monday, you will have already have been asked to turn in the 3rd assignment. And boy, what a pace, guys. I contacted my dean and asked if there's anything I could do. I honestly, I felt badly for you guys. This is so hyper paced. But he just told me it is what it is. And that's the nature of a summer class, packing in all this material into such a short span of time. So number 1, just looked at capitalism for better and for worse with the English now, starting in 1607 into Jamestown, Virginia. This, capitalism for better and for worse, that there were burgeoning opportunities for more and more English men and women, particularly men. But if you already had money, and already had connections, you had huge advantages over your commoner counterparts. Okay. So like I said, I try to give a lot away on the title itself. And this one's pretty self-explanatory. Virginia from a native perspective. So in this book, right, the English are going to be greedy, insatiable, ungrateful, just devious, just constantly taking advantage of the Native Americans. And to some Native Americans, for quite some time after the Civil Rights Movement, this seems to have been the norm in historiography, in the writing of history, whereby they would make victims of the Native Americans. But I'm not sure how long it took, precisely when this happened, but then Native American and other minority groups that had this type of historiography to read said, you know what, we find this to be a little bit demeaning and condescending. Yes, we want to elicit sympathy from readers, but we also want them to know things that we did, that we changed, power that we had, that we weren't just like childlike victims. And that's known as agency in historiography, human agency. So you're going to see that later on in this assignment. Then I take a 180, and this guy, boy, I tell you what, talk about politically incorrect. But I just thought, man, what courage. And I might as well round it out from number 2. Number 3 is a 180-degree turn from number 2, right? Whereby the English are justified in what they did, and the Native Americans, if anyone, are vilified in David Price's book that he wrote in the 1990s. And then the title says it all here. Look into this argument, if you would. Slavery was an economic, not a racist decision. Yikes. Okay, again, me putting this together does not mean that I believe this, okay? Please keep that in mind. I find a thought-provoking thesis and I go with it, whether I personally adhere to it or not. So that's a tough question to address, right? And so just look and see how well or how poorly I put together the argument that it was about money and not about racism, employing slaves. All right. And again, I go over some of the supporting detail, etc., in the video. So I'd ask you, please consider watching the video. And then African-American agency in early South Carolina. I just mentioned to you what agency means in historiography. So you're going to find a sense of empowerment from African-American slaves in colonial South Carolina, things that they actively did, actively demanded to help improve their own plight, however short-lived those benefits were. All right. So again, I go over in more detail in the video. And then number 6, I don't need to say anything besides read the title. Of course, slave conditions were awful. Believe it or not, when I was in school, way back when, we read Fogel and Ingerman, Time on the Cross book, and they tried to contend that being a slave was not that physically of a brutal situation to endure. Yeah, you heard me right. And so like, wow. All right. And so of course I go against that and contend and see how well or how poorly I defend myself in the slaves' conditions being awful. And then Native American agency with the French. You're going to find evidence of some Native American historians somewhat bragging, right, about the manner by which in the southern Mississippian Valley, how the Natchez and other native tribes bullied the French, and see how that came about, how they kind of bullied them. And it's again showing Native American agency. And then again, I give away so much by the title. If you should choose number 8, I think this is the final one. French Louisiana was fluid by accident. And what I mean by fluid is, I mean, there were opportunities more relative to other civilizations in the early modern era. You're talking about the early 1700s here. There were more opportunities for more people to genuinely just be more autonomous in their life, to marry whom they wanted, to do what they wanted for a living, to trade with certain commodities, etc., etc. But notice that it was by accident, according to this thesis, not by the designs of the French leaders of Louisiana. All right. So again, if I could I get a thumbs up from anyone? Are you guys with me? You feel relatively good about these assignments? Thank you. Thank you very much. Right on. All right. Well, I am very happy to give you your extra credit for, and I tell you what, since technically, yeah, assignment 3 is due before we meet again, and I just briefly went over it. I'm going to give you today credit for extra credit for 2 assignments. I'm going to give you 5 extra points for assignment 2, the Spaniards, and 3 Southern colonies. Nathan Zachariah, let me see. Yes, sir. All right. Okay. All right, you guys. So please, if you would, if you have the time, uh, take advantage of the videos and watch the videos as I go into more detail on them, in them. But you guys, I wish you well. Yes. Okay, that's a good question. I have almost about 80 students. So it's going to take me a while, but I'm going to begin correcting the assignments this afternoon or at the latest this evening. But I won't finish them all tonight. But you should be able to expect them. Yeah, no, it's not your fault, Benjamin. Thank you. Yeah, I have my hands full for sure. 14 assignments in like 5 weeks. So I have a lot of correcting to do. And I have on my list, I have 80 students or more. So please be patient, but I will begin grading this afternoon. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. You guys have a good one. Okay. I'm going to let you go.
I have a question.
Yes.
For the homework, so basically, do we just state the thesis and then we add facts about it? Or since it's argumentative, do we need to have an opposing side as well?
You don't need to, but you can. What I would recommend is just continue looking at my sample answer to number 1 in modules
Uh-huh.
and just notice what I do on that. And that's all I ask is for you to simply cite what the thesis is virtually right away.
Okay.
Give an example, at least one example of supporting data used, right?
Mm-hmm.
To support that thesis.
Okay.
And then, yes, Anthony, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. All right. You're welcome. Yeah, so at any rate, cite the thesis, give an example of how it's defended, and then say why what you find to be persuasive, convincing, and what you think could have made it better.
Okay.
And just do it briefly within half a page is fine.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you so much.
All right. No, you're very welcome. And Hafsa Mustafa, I received your message. And so I duly noted your name down as an exception for being late on the early assignments. The student is in another country. So my goodness, that's a valid excuse for turning them in late. Okay. All right. So anyone else have a question? Okay, you guys. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. All right. And I'll see you on Monday. You have a nice day as well. Thank you, Brianna. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Bye.